This episode is a bit different. I am splitting up features into different sections. This section is all about projectiles and particles. On August 1st, I made a video that demonstrated the first implementation of projectiles. These projectiles are actually very optimized, and in fact they are destroyed when they leave the room. Once the system was set up, I began experimenting with what these could do. I added a feature I envisioned from the very start: bombs. This projectile is a bit different as it has sort of a friction feature and will eventually stop. After 3 to 4 seconds, it will explode. The explosion also gives off light for added effect. This object projectile also collides with walls like the player. However, there was a glitch that allowed them to slip out from the top left and right edges. This was solved temporarily, but has seemed to return. The explosion from the bomb is unique. It deals damage in a circle with a diameter of 96 pixels. It also gives off light and used to have a temporary sound which was then removed. Or was it? Boom sound effect. The player is told about this radius by an indicator that appears 1 second before the bomb explodes. You may have noticed the blood particles given from the zombie when he is hurt. These particles are simply modified projectiles. They are most similar to bombs. I know Game Maker has a particle system, but for right now this will do the trick while I learn about it. Magic projectiles and explosions give off these particles as well. While the system seemed to work fine, it was only working fine for the player. Other entities couldn't fire these projectiles without it heading towards the mouse, so I had to do something. And I added an aiming variable that is taken into account when firing a projectile. I had to rework some of the projectile functions, but in the end everything worked out fine. I also made it to where the player/enemy's projectile wouldn't come back to hurt them. Yet it can hurt some entities of the same type. I hope to use this later in an aggravation state when I implement enemy AI. On August 13th, I made another branch of the game for the experimental combat test. I used some of the same functions I used in the projectiles, such as direction, and a similar aiming variable called user. I also implemented a sort of weapon variable so that I can have a system for different weapons in the future. Getting the animations for combat was tricky. I had to take the cursor's location into account and apply animations based on that. The biggest problem was the player's idle state. I added states in the player's code to be referenced and to make things easier. I added a check to make sure the player wasn't attacking, and if the player was, then the idle state would wait until it was done. The problem was the idle state was ignoring this check, and I spent almost an hour trying to fix it till I realized it was something simple: a spelling error. Once I sorted everything out, I added the actual function to the hit reg system. I also made it to where you can open chests just by hitting them. This adds a certain range to hitting enemies and interacting with chests that is more realistic. The next day I worked on improving the system a bit, in such that when the player is actually clicked, it will play a combat animation. I also changed the hit reg system from being invisible to having a sort of slash animation. I then worked on the player's health system by allowing them to die. This was also a pain to implement, but this time the problem was simply just the method I used to check for player states. I then fixed it and it works. It just works. After the combat test, I decided it was time to move on to the next stage of development, Alpha 3. Just for a timeline, development started with a testing phase in Episode 1, the first Alpha in Episode 2, the lighting test in Alpha number 2 in Episode 3, and now in this episode we have the combat test, and now the third Alpha. One interesting thing about this phase is that there is a feature that I remember developing, but I have no footage or record of it, and this is the depth system. I'm not going to go into detail, but this is just a system which mimics depth. Basically, if the player is in front of an object, it'll render in front, and if it's behind an object, it'll render behind that object, and vice versa. These first few features I will list off are combat related. The first 2 features are important, but also kind of minor since they are expected, and they are adjustment to the hitboxes and object-to-object collision. The next feature I added was arrow key combat. This is something I mentioned for a little while now, and I finally got to implementing it. It's planned to stay, but depending on how development goes, I may remove this feature. Another feature related to combat is sprinting. I tried my hand at implementing this in the last episode, but it had a bit of a bug, as you can see here. I'm actually very stoked to have sprinting, but the way I implemented it causes some problems later in the video. But I will probably save this for a future behind the scenes video. The only reason I implemented sprinting was because it was a combat test, and I started to use scripts for player actions to make the code and the player's step event more tidy, and so that's about the only reason I added sprinting at this point. It's also a feature I really wanted for a long time. These next few events I will list off are kind of like the onions on a McDonald's cheeseburger, because they're just not interesting and shouldn't be on there. No offense if you like onions on your cheeseburger, pickles just have more taste. These features are camera related, and as we know, the camera is an ever-changing system that must be granted every desire and want that it requires. First, you can now change the resolution of the game. If you want to know, it goes from a base of 1080p to 360p, 540p, 720p, and 900p. It can also go to 1080p and beyond, but I need to work on a full screen system before I can implement those. Lastly, I refined the camera by allowing you to change aspect ratio from 16:9 to 4:3. So far I haven't worked on 16:10 and ultra wide support, but that'll hopefully be coming later, most likely. At this time, I also added a restart functionality to the game, and I also removed a little delay from when the camera follows the player. This was just creating some little visual glitches, and it's hard to describe, but I'll just show you in some footage right here. So I guess I kind of lied. Here's some of the boring stuff. This is like the grease-soaked bottom bun of the McDouble. Okay, so torches now manage their own light, meaning I don't have to place each and every light whenever I want to place a torch. And projectiles are now managed through scripts. I also implemented a quote-unquote debug GUI. This is important just to know some random stats without using Game Maker's debug mode. I also added a random number generator, and this RNG system will help make random events a bit more controllable, such as projectile accuracy, and it'll also help with secret events and Easter eggs. While messing around in the game, I noticed an odd bug would occur after sprinting. I briefly mentioned this earlier, but this bug basically stopped the player from attacking with their fist after sprinting, and the source was some code that should have set the player's animation to idle, but instead it was setting the state just because of the way I implemented it. And there's more footage of me fixing the issue, but I'm gonna save it for a behind the scenes video. And this basically just gave this glitch the name, the no melee after sprinting glitch, aka NMASG. And stay tuned for that behind the scenes video so you get a little behind the scenes look of me bug fixing. So, how have you guys enjoyed the video so far? I'm doing something different with the video. I'd appreciate some feedback with it. I kind of like what I'm doing better. But I'm still gonna try and put a segment with my lovely face in it. I'm gonna explain some more history about what made my game come to life. It is basically the extended universe by Mike the Maniac. So the origins of the game. The game I'm developing right now kind of has its roots back in the summer of 2018. I began developing a game engine with Java using some help from YouTube and websites of the such. The engine I was intending on making was for a different game, and it was kind of plagued with some problems. And it had some cool features, but some of the problems were running on Java, which is an aging language. As you know, Minecraft runs on Java, and Minecraft always isn't the most optimized when it comes to running, especially on servers and stuff, but Mojang's trying their best of fixing it. The game could not compile to a jar file correctly, and it was just kind of a hassle to develop for. There were classes upon classes. There were no mapping tools. I had to make every single map with a text file. Game Maker Studio 2 scripts and the GML language is just much cleaner. And here's a little example of entity collision. As you can see, this is some of the code from the Java engine. It's been a while since I looked at it, so I can't really translate it that well. But basically, you have just some stats to get from the entity, and then when it comes to the little move variable, it checks if there's no collision, then move X, and then if there is, then it sets a variable to true. And I'm pretty sure this move X function is from a different class, so it just calls that function. While in Game Maker, for moving right, at least, you just do if place meeting is the X variable plus the walk speed and the Y variable and the object you're colliding with. In this case, collider object, which is just a parent object of what you want to collide with. And if it collides with that, then you basically cancel out the walk speed, leaving the X position to just stay the same. And if it doesn't collide, then the walk speed will just equal the set walk speed. And it's just much easier to read, much easier to implement for walking left, up, down, all that jazz. Now, about the engine I was making, it had some cool features such as a tile system, entity system, menus, and a rudimentary physics engine, which I made myself. And it wasn't intended for top-down gameplay, it was more intended for a side-scroller game, the physics. And it was eventually scrapped, and then I just put it up on GitHub and made this little character just to kind of see when you're walking straight, when you're walking left, when you're walking right. That's just why there's one big ol' eye right there. And that kind of led to the development. As you can see on his shirt is kind of like what you see in a game when textures don't load, just a purple and black image, just some words under it. And this right here was unused. I eventually took it off GitHub. No one was interested in it. No one looked at it. And then after not working on the engine for about a month and a half, I decided to kind of envision a game. And this was going to be a game that would probably help me get some basics down for the game that I wanted to make. And so I just took some of my art that I knew how to make and just basically created the player character, some unused animations down there, zombie, and then this is just a rough representation of what the tile set looked like back then. As you can see, there's some more noise in the bricks, just to kind of mock how they looked before I cartoonified them. And yeah, this is basically some of the first art that went along with the game back in that time. And now I'm gonna kind of explain the timeline of these videos. So we have the first game devlog airing on January 6, 2019 that had movement animations in the horrible art segment. The second one was about a month or two later on March 17th, 2019 that had a camera system, tile maps, animations along with the movement, and the very first alpha. And then about 3 or 4 months later I released one in July, and that had a fix for diagonal movement, a lighting test, refinement of the camera system, a completely new camera system, alpha version 2, and collision. And then this video right here, we had the particles and projectiles, the combat test, alpha version 3, and this little history segment. And basically a more expanded timeline would be June 2018, the first sort of inner workings, to January, which is when the development on this game actually began. So, what's in it for the future of the game? What about a beta? There's so many alphas. What about a beta? Well, I plan on making a beta. It's going to be public, unlike the alphas. But I need to begin thinking of marketing and a way to get beta testers. And for a good beta, I need to develop a better weapon system that works hand in hand with an item system, some more mechanics of the game, enemy AI, something I promised for a while but never got to because AI is complicated. General user interface and some level design just to have some test levels for a beta. And what exactly does a beta need? Well, the beta needs more game content listed above. Security, I just don't want to be putting a random exe file out in the wild. Some beta testers. I'm going to need a way for feedback and bug reports. And I'm going to need some marketing. And some of my ideas for feedback would be a website or an itch.io or Steam page. And itch.io is most likely easiest because I think it's more designed for indie developers. Marketing, I could do word of mouth, could do ads, but ads need money. Or a Kickstarter or a GoFundMe or whatever there is to do to raise some more funding. Practicality is currently unknown, but I'm estimating it's most likely to fail. I'm just being pessimistic here. So that leads to the question, is there a call to action for beta? Not now. I am going to leave a poll in the cards up in this corner of the video. And it's going to contain a question saying, should I create a form containing questions to determine a general interest in a beta? And feel free to answer that. This will come sometime in the future maybe. Just leave some other ideas and criticisms of my ideas and the game in general in the comments down below. I really want some feedback on a lot of this stuff. And it may be too early to think of beta, but might as well start thinking early. And now, this is a section of the video where I explain some extra stuff that I didn't want to cram into the history. So, as I mentioned, we have arrow key combat in the game, but another thing I want to implement is controller input. I'm not really thinking of developing for console platforms right now. I just know that some Windows users might prefer this, and Mac and Linux will probably come before any sort of mobile or console platform. And I know people playing on Mac or Linux might also prefer a controller. In terms of Mac and Linux support, Linux will probably why do I keep saying that? Linux support will probably come sooner. Just easier to install Linux, and I don't really have any sort of Apple device to test out Mac OS on, so that'll probably come first before Mac OS. And then in terms of mobile platforms, Android will probably be supported before iOS. I'm not really a big Apple fan, and Android's probably easier to develop for. It's more open source, and there are some fees that come along with developing for the App Store and Google Play Store, but I think the App Store has a much bigger fee, and so maybe my strategy will be releasing on PC platforms, then focusing on mobile. Just some life updates. I'm busy with school a lot. I am taking college courses, and so when it comes to developing on the game and making these videos, it is much easier to spend a lot of time making these videos. When I make these videos, it takes a lot of hours, and mostly when I'm making game dev videos, I am not developing the game. And that's kind of why I'm splitting it up into segments. I might be doing that for future videos, and I'm just gonna say it, there's a lot of hours that go into editing. At least all of these sections probably took an hour or two to edit to get to my standard, plus export time, and this will probably take longer, and with potential behind the scenes video, it's gonna take much longer. So a lot of hours go into making these videos. That's kind of why January, March, and July videos were kind of spread out a lot more, like a month or two between episode 1 and 2, and a lot more between episode 3, just because these take time. And I'd say my video making has improved a lot since January after that horrible art segment. And so these videos do kind of take a long time to make, so if you want to be informed on when the next game dev video comes out, it'll probably be in a style similar to this. If you want to be informed, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. I don't want to pressure you, but consider doing that. And if you like the video, maybe drop a like or a comment. Definitely try and give me some feedback. And thank you guys so much for watching. I kind of hope to grow the channel, and you guys are helping me do that. And just thank you. Thank you very much. And with that said, I'll see you in the next video.